So as we went ahead and did a very, very quick review of last week, like Monday. Is it Monday or Tuesday? Tuesday. Whatever day it was, not yesterday. We went over like the stuff that we learned about the marine biomes. And another type of marine biome is a coral reef. Now, this is kind of hard to imagine, but this stuff in the back, Brandon, is actually alive. Not just the fish, the coral reef itself is alive. It's made up of tiny little animals called polyps. You don't have to know that. They eat algae. That's important. We've talked about how important the algae are in the ocean, right? Because they provide the earth with over half of its oxygen. Because algae needs a lot of sunlight to survive, coral reefs are typically found in fairly shallow water. Amanda is not going to deep dive down into the bottom of the ocean and find a coral reef down there if there's no sun. At least none that we have come across that I know of yet. Because it has to have algae, which has to have sunlight in order to go through photosynthesis and create its own food, thus starting the food chain that we've already learned about. And to be very honest with you, you're going to realize here real quick that the coral reef is not something we're going to cover very deeply. This is the only slide I have on the coral reef. You don't need to write down all of this stuff. You can literally write down this first sentence and say a coral reef is another type of marine biome. At least have an idea of what a coral reef is if we mention it. I don't want you to think it's terrestrial. It is a marine, it's an aquatic biome, but that's about the extent that we're going to dig into the coral reef. So you don't have to jot down a whole lot on that paper. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's the next one that will be starting a fire with our pencils and our paper, writing so many notes about, because I'm pretty sure estuaries is like right around the corner. All right, I'm going to move on from coral reefs because you really don't need to know that much about them, other than at least we've talked about them and seen them. And if you happen to see that in an answer choice, you can think, yep, that's an aquatic biome, and move on. Estuaries. Now, you already know this is an extremely important thing in our aquatic biomes, and you know that because you've already seen the word estuary on like all 4 of your morning works, right? I feel like it's been on there every week. It shows up all the time. The test makers love the estuary. I don't understand why they love it so much, but they certainly do. Estuaries are pretty amazing places. They are where, and you can kind of see in the background here, where rivers and oceans meet. So this area right in here, where the rivers and the oceans are kind of meeting, are estuaries. Now we have to think about something when we're talking about an estuary. It's going to bring up a couple of different vocabulary words as well, other than estuary. If you have fresh water mixing with salt water, you have to know what fresh water is, you have to know what salt water is, and you have to know what it's called when we mix those two things together. Who remembers, just from that early morning vocabulary stuff, what we call it when fresh water and salt water mix? Anybody? Maddox? Brackish water. We're going to take a minute to jot that down. So, Todd, if we have to look at what an estuary is, definition's on the board, it's on the anchor chart, where rivers and oceans meet. Because rivers have fresh water, little or no salt, oceans have salt water. If you have 2 different types of water mixing, they have a very special term for that, and they call that brackish water. Brackish water. Because that water is flowing all across the land and down into the ocean, and you have the ocean as well, there is a lot of very rich nutrient soil at the bottom of an estuary. There's a lot of nutrients in the water. And one thing we didn't talk about at the oceans, if you live out in the ocean, it's kind of wide open, right? Kind of like playing hide and seek in the field. Not going to work out very well, is it? So fish will come into the estuaries where there's a little bit more cover, and that's where they'll have their babies. And that's why they sometimes call them the nurseries of the sea. The fish will come in because the water is still salty enough for those fish to survive. They have cover for their kids, they have their babies, and then they make their way back out into the oceans. I don't know how many times I can say this, but Veda, here it is one more time at the top. An estuary is a body of water where fresh water and salt water meet and mingle. We call that brackish water. I don't know if you could not have an estuary along the coast, right? How are you going to have a river and an ocean meet if you're not at the coast? Swamps, beaches, coral reefs can all be near estuaries. That makes sense, right? I mean, obviously, if it's where rivers and oceans meet, a beach wouldn't be nearby. A coral reef might be something very different, and a swamp could be kind of different. But it's something we can talk about. Many of us have probably been to or near an estuary. If you've been to Oak Island, you've been near an estuary. If you've been to something called a bay or a harbor or an inlet, you've been near an estuary. In order to live in an estuary, you have to have a very special adaptation as a plant and as an animal. You have to be able to survive in fresh water or salt water. Because remember, we have tides in the ocean, right? When the tide comes in, that means the ocean's pushing in the water and the estuary is saltier. When the tide goes out and it is low tide, the river is still flowing, and it would mean that that area has more fresh water. It's still a mix of the two, still brackish, but it's more salty or less salty, depending on what time of day it is. So in order to live in an estuary, in Collins, I guarantee you'll see this, I promise you'll see this on a test. What adaptation do you need to be able to live inside of an estuary? Varying salt levels. Varying salt levels is what you have to be able to adapt to. So again, make sure that you have this kind of jotted down somewhere and put a star beside. The last time I put a star beside something, Fabiana, did you see it on the test? Yep, pretty much word for word, right? How do we classify consumers? By what they eat. To live in an estuary, plants and animals must be able to adapt to the varying or changing salt levels. Something very important that we'll need to talk about. I know you say again, do you understand the importance of this word? You're going to see it over and over and over again. So, we know that it's brackish water. We know that's where rivers and oceans meet. We know that it's the nurseries of the ocean. We know a lot about that. You have to be able to adapt to the changing salt levels. Well, what adapts to the changing salt levels? Here are some of the animals. Alligators, crabs, different types of fish, a heron, which is like a bird, and ducks. Estuaries are home to very unique plants and animals that have adapted to brackish water, that mix of fresh water and seawater. Birds, fish, crabs, lobsters, clams, shellfish, raccoons, possums, and skunks. Now, does that mean that they're like gulping down salt water? No, that means that they live in that area. Does the skunk live in the estuary? No, he lives around the estuary on the land, but he's able to go into that water and get food sources as well, because otters and skunks and possums and raccoons are very happy to go in there and pick up a clam and crack it open and have a feast, because they would enjoy that very much so. If you're at home, you need to watch this video. It's important. You can get on Nearpod and do that. Mangrove trees. Here's a very special plant. Salt water will kill plants. You guys agree with that? I mean, we can't drink it. You can't dump it on a plant because it will kill the plant pretty quickly. If you don't believe me, we'll get some salt water and start feeding it some of the plants in the window. It'll be dead before the week's over. It's not good for the plants. Mangrove trees have a very special adaptation. There's that word that we've used over and over again, adaptation, where a plant or an animal changes to fit into its environment. A mangrove tree says, I want to live where there's a mix of salt and fresh water, and it can be very salty at some times. Here's what they do. They are able to filter out the salt through these crazy roots down here. Now, I don't know if you've ever taken a kayak tour on the coast. If you do, and you go into some of the estuaries and go up some of the rivers that flow into the ocean, you're going to see some of these mangrove trees. And I mean this, if one of you does do that, please bring a mangrove tree leaf back to me, because these leaves taste salty if you lick them. Kind of have to figure that out on my own, because they're able to get rid of the salt through them. Like desert plants, they store fresh water. They have a waxy coating on the leaves that stops them from going through transpiration. Transpiration is kind of like perspiration. Perspiration is when I sweat and you sweat. Transpiration is when plants sweat. Now, I know a long time ago, Brandon brought in a bottle because I knew as soon as we got to transpiration, we were going to be doing some experiments with putting some plants in a bottle. And then all of a sudden, there's like fresh water in there. Where did it come from? Well, it comes out of the plants. Plants sweat. They go through. They release water when they get hot. There's small hairs on the leaves of some species that deflect wind and sunlight, which reduces their water loss. Some mangroves grow these roots that stick up out of the ground. They're kind of like snorkels. When high tide comes in, Veda, they are still able to breathe. And here's pneumatophores that allow mangroves to cope with the daily flooding by the tide. So mangroves have some very, very special adaptations. You don't have to know everything about mangrove trees, kiddos. You can literally write, mangrove trees have adapted to live in the estuary, and you will be fine. So again, just to save some of us that are trying to write down every single one of these words, which is not what I want you to do in all of my slides, I just want you to know that mangrove trees are one example of a plant that has adapted to live in the estuary. They did that because they have special roots that filter out the salt, because most plants wouldn't be able to survive with all of that salt in the water. In just a second, we're going to watch another Nature Boom Time video, but I'm going to wait until this video's over, so this big square is not the way everybody is trying to watch this. But if you're at home, I highly recommend watching this. Great video. What adaptations do plants and animals need to live in an estuary? You may answer that question now.